Hi, welcome to our last session of Net Zero Skills. Sorry, here we go. Today is talking about climate action. So the last of a series of 4, we've already covered understanding, getting started with, and working together on climate action. You can find all of our past sessions as recordings and all of the resources that go with it on our website. So the link is there, and we'll share it again at the end of the session. So today, talking about climate action, so everything around communication. And we've got a packed agenda, as usual, welcome and introductions. And then we'll talk a bit about audiences, understanding your audience, and how to lay out your messaging accordingly, so approaches to messaging, have a Q&A before the break, and then after the break we're going to dive a bit more into more detail around planning your communications and some tips and tricks for delivering effective comms. And then, as always, plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And then just a couple of minutes to look at what's next. So as usual, quick round of introduction. So I'm Annie, I'm the project manager for Net Zero Skills. I've got a background in civil engineering and work in project management now. Mainly things around stakeholder management, change management, and those sort of things. So I work for a big engineering consultancy, but I also lead a couple of community projects here in Hitchin, where I live in North Hertfordshire. And I've been working with Cambridge Carbon Footprint for 2 and a bit years now. And yeah, with Alana. So I'll let her introduce herself and Cambridge Carbon Footprint.
Hi, yes. So some of you are familiar with me. My name is Alana. I'm the manager at Cambridge Carbon Footprint. So my background, I did a Masters of Sustainability in Sydney, which is where I'm from originally. And I've been working with CCF on 9 years, for 9 years, on a variety of projects. So we do all sorts of work, so mainly geared towards helping individuals to find the ways in which they can have an impact. So in their individual lives, in their communities, and in their places of work. And we have sort of 2 strands of work that we do within that. So carbon reduction, so what we can do to actually reduce our carbon emissions, and then also climate leadership. So how can we encourage and enable other people around us to take action on climate change as well, which obviously fits very neatly with Net Zero Now and what we're doing here. A couple of other projects that we work on are the Cambridge Climate Change Charter, which we are delivering on behalf of the City Council. And as part of that, we have developed a carbon footprint calculator, which enables an individual to go online and quite easily understand what their carbon footprints are. And we also run open eco homes. We've been running for, this is our 12th year now, actually. It's the longest running project of its kind in the UK, which opens up new builds and retrofits that are more energy efficient and more sustainable. And you know, obviously sort of talking about energy efficiency and what we can do to reduce our energy bills at the moment is quite timely as well. So we'll be ramping up our work on that over the coming months towards a series of events which will be happening in September.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll give a short introduction into net zero, what we mean when we talk about net zero carbon. So just a quick reminder, net zero is when we reach that balance between the emissions that we produce and the greenhouse gas emissions that we produce, that we emit into our atmosphere, and the greenhouse gases that we extract from the atmosphere. We want to reach net zero as fast as we can, just to make sure that the greenhouse effect is mitigated. And in this race to net zero, Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority is actually lagging behind slightly, behind the national average. Our emissions are higher and they fall more slowly. So there is quite a bit of catching up that we have to do in our area. And when we have a look at what the emissions are that we generate, it's about a quarter is produced by eating, by consuming food and beverages, but then also a big chunk is for heating our homes and using energy. Another big chunk is traveling, be it flying or be it cars and public transport, and then also things like shopping, the items that we buy, clothing, furniture, and so on. And then there will also always be sort of a small overhead just by living in the UK, by having access to heated swimming pools and schools and having a working police service and government and so on. All of this infrastructure will also always produce a certain amount of carbon. And as I said, our goal is to reach net zero, where we're not adding additional new emissions to the atmosphere, but we also take out the same amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. So we have to look at reducing our carbon footprint, so the emissions that we release, by looking at the food that we consume, by the energy that we use, how we move, so transport, and how we shop. So those are the emissions that we generate, but then we can also look at the carbon sinks. So how can we make sure that we capture carbon, capture greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, so we can make sure that we improve and grow carbon sinks by growing trees, improving soil quality, and so on. So these are the sort of activities that we're looking at when we want to reach net zero. So I'm going to hand over to Jasmine, who's going to introduce herself. She's our guest speaker today and knows everything there is to know about communicating around climate change and climate action. So she'll share her knowledge today, and I'll hand over to you, Jasmine. I'll stop sharing and you can share.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Can everyone see my screen? I'm now unmuted. Okay, can everyone hear me now? Okay, we've got the ball rolling. So yeah, lovely to meet everyone tonight. My name's Jasmine Clark. So we're going to talk about communication of climate action, or tonight we're going to start looking at audiences and a bit about the research that's out there of how we that's looked into talking about climate change with audiences. So a bit about me first. I am currently working as an environment campaigner, but up until last month, I did work for Cambridge Carbon Footprint. So my key role was to work as their Cambridge Climate Change Charter project coordinator. So I worked on basically getting that out into the Cambridge community, trying to get people, businesses and local organisations to sign up to the charter and really spread the word out into the local community. Before that, I also then worked as their communications officer. And so yeah, I've worked for them for just under a year probably. Alongside that, I also worked for Cambridge Stable Food for a couple of years as their communications and media officer. And my background is kind of mixed. So alongside my professional communication career, I have a background in an undergrad in environmental science. So I kind of learned all of the nitty-gritty science stuff behind climate change, learning about net zero, sustainability, and then I expanded that in a degree in environment, culture and society, and looked at more about how can we really apply this to real world situations, how can we get people to really engage in these issues. So on to the talk. We are all here because we know what climate change is and it's happening, and we want to do something about it. And one of the most important things we can do is to take climate leadership by speaking to other people about climate change. So yeah, speaking openly about climate change and raising awareness that people can take is one of the most powerful things we can all do to make a difference to the climate emergency. Well, we might be all glued into the reality that climate change is happening now and will affect all of us in the near future. Many still don't realise the scale and the impact and how it links back to their daily life. So that's why it's really important to talk about it, especially connecting to people's motivations and helping create real lasting change. There's kind of many different communication channels that you can use when talking about climate change and climate action. So we've got in person, so that's from holding your own events or workshops, talking to co-workers at where you work, outreach talks, or even just having a conversation with your family and friends over the dinner table. That is a form of talking about climate action. You've obviously got more in print and media, such as newspapers and newsletters, posters, radio and TV, and then increasingly so online, so social media, website, emails, videos. That's just another avenue you can use to talk about climate action. So kind of a think about what do we think about climate change, climate action communicators at the moment. So I've picked 3 that are quite famous: David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and Leonardo DiCaprio. So kind of a think about what they all might have in common. And I also like to think about what hasn't worked for them. They all have their different audience that they connect with, and all have their different communication approaches, which is okay because there are different audiences that are going to resonate with different approaches that you take. It can be tricky broaching the subject of climate change, especially if you're new to these conversations or discuss it for new audiences, and different communicators have different approaches that work well for them, and you will too, and you'll find that out as you go along. So we're just going to help cover some of those fundamentals to help shape those beginning successful conversations. So first off, know your audience. So if we think back to the 3 climate change communicators on the previous slide, we all know they're famous climate change communicators, and they all have different approaches and connect with diverging audiences. So really, in a nutshell, climate communication is really finding common ground and overlapping interests. So one of the key fundamentals when talking about climate change is to know your audience and tailor your discussions so they connect with their values and political views. Research has shown this and has a bigger influence on changing attitudes about climate change than actually the specific level of scientific knowledge and understanding. So while that's still really relevant, so all the facts about how many emissions that are going into the air and all the difference that can make, so they have that basic understanding, it's also essential that you make connections and how it connects with their key values, their views and the passions, and how it's going to affect them themselves. Different people, different concerns. So if we can tune into those interests and motivations, we'll be more effective in our communications, such as, like, for instance, there are different characteristics that shape their value systems, such as age, gender, ethnicity, location, upbringing, faith, political beliefs, education, and life concerns. So a key bit of research in this was the Britain Talks Climate Change by Climate Outreach. So it kind of delved into the different audiences and values across Britain to help get a deeper idea on the issues that motivate climate discussions between different sectors of the public. And they surveyed over 10,000 people in England, Wales and Scotland to base this research on. And through this, they identified 7 key groups who have similar behavioural analysis. So we can always say, we don't have to go as in depth, but if you want to know who your audience is, you can do a survey before you carry out your events or your climate action to kind of identify your particular audience. So yeah, the 7 they've got, and we'll go a bit more into it in a few slides, was progressive activists. So these are people who are politically active, vocal and focused on climate change. Backbone conservatives, so they're patriotic, proud, food, farming and rural life. Civic pragmatists, I never say that word myself. Moderate, politically demotivated but sustainable at home. Established liberals, optimistic, empowered, low carbon solutions and growth. Disengaged battlers, unheard, frustrated by middle class environmentalism. Disengaged traditionalists, so they're alienated, skeptical, least engaged on climate. And then finally, loyal nationalists, patriotic, threatened and concerned about localised inequality. And so for each of those audiences, there will be a different narrative or technique that might help get them engaged in climate action discussions. So the key findings, they really found that none of the 7 segments are defined by strong ideological skepticism towards climate change. So they all believed it was real, they all believed it was human induced, and they all believed that they were feeling the effects across Britain. Also, they thought it was a concern for everybody. And there is wide recognition that the UK should be one of the most ambitious countries in the world in tackling climate change, and that doing so could unlock new economic opportunities and jobs. So that's all very positive to hear. We're like, yes. But then the key bit of the report was that also certain values and issues have almost universal resonance across Britain. So no matter the audience background, these 3 kind of values were found to work for all the audiences. So that was like protecting future generations, creating a healthier and green society, preserving the countryways, and trying to reduce waste. So if you're talking to a general audience or unsure who makes up the specific demographic, it can be useful to start with these 3 points when framing and start having a starting base. So if everyone says, yes, climate change is real, it's happening, it's a concern for everyone, why are we still having that lag? Why is it still important to talk about climate action? Well, a recent study of 10 countries, including the US, UK, France and Germany, found that actually few people are willing to change their personal lifestyle to save the planet. And they actually prioritise measures that are already habits in their everyday life, and kind of count that as being pro-environmental. So in some places you can see that there's a disconnect between the reality of the climate crisis and the scale of action required to tackle this collective issue. So a key stat that Cambridge Carbon Footprint really likes to use, and emphasis wherever possible, is that 60% of changes need to help us to reach net zero depends on behaviour change by individuals, and this is according to the Committee on Climate Change. So raising awareness of the vital actions and behaviour change people can take and or make is a key way that we can all play a key role in Cambridge's response to the climate emergency. So a quick run through of the breakdown of the different audience types. So first we have the established liberals. So approach that works well for them is to tell an authentically positive story. So how things can continue to improve. And they also like the rational economics of climate policies. So the green recovery is a sensible way of investment. Build a coalition around food and farming. So established liberals recognise responsibility for creating a cleaner, safer and natural environment. And on the right, you can see some of the key characteristics of what an established liberal is. So that they're quite high earning, they're optimistic, they lean a bit more to the right in their politics. So next we've got backbone conservatives. So some of their key characteristics are British pride, they're trusting, conservative, they're a bit more of the older generation. They would consider themselves hardworking and traditional. So the issues that they identified that backbone conservatives care about were such as farming, rural way of life, British leadership on environment standards. So these were some of the key narratives that if you want to talk about climate action, that you should maybe use as the basis of your message. But also consider the messenger that's giving that message. So for instance, scientists and farmers, they have been shown to resonate well with backbone conservatives, and they're more trusted when you're using it. And then also, like previously, they like national pride in practical achievements. So some more examples, you've got progressive activists. So these tend to be the youngest segment. So the highest proportion of university educated, and they are a high proportion of like high earners. These are the people that have been shown to be most receptive to talking about climate change, taking climate action. So they're opinionated, confident, outward looking, and restless for change. So whilst they're obviously already taking some climate action themselves, try and channel their desire more for radical action and their antagonism towards government by mobilising them to use as new fronts for change. So try and get them to open up into the community and work with other people, maybe be climate leaders themselves and start discussions. So you've got civic pragmatists. So these are kind of, they're still left, but they're not as kind of activist as progressive activists are, but they're very focused on the community, and they're concerned the world is becoming a more dangerous place. So it's been found that key approaches to work with civic pragmatists is to build on their existing civic engagement and their high level of trust of institutions by making it easy for them to participate in change. And build on their confidence and conviction and shift their concern to a deeper commitment on climate change. So, and key narratives identified was restoring balance, not balance, and a sense of unity. So then we move on to the ones that are slightly more right-leaning. So you've got the disengaged battlers. So we've got a relatively young group. They're urban, educated to a medium level, and tend to be financially insecure. So we always suggest that to build on the trust of this segment by really listening to them and show how the benefits of climate action will actually benefit people like them. And show diversity is key. So show these people in diverse green jobs and avoid pushing a middle class environmental lifestyle, and talk about fairness, not justice. And then the other one, disengaged traditionalists. So they're kind of a diverse in age groups. You've got millennials and baby boomers on the other side. They're most likely to be climate skeptics, so climate action messages are unlikely to land successfully. So more of a focus here is to focus on building trust, as you'll be at the beginning parts of the conversations, and use a trusted messenger. So more like ordinary people whose lives are changing for the better, rather than say what a high scientist or politician is saying on the issue. And then the finest group is the loyal nationalists. So this is one of the oldest segments. They're most likely to describe themselves as working class, and they often feel angry or threatened by stuff that's going on in the world. So invoking national pride around British leadership and climate change is a key narrative that works for them, and emphasising that rules apply for everyone, and really kind of emphasising that the impact's close to home. So drawing like what's happening near them, for instance, increasing extreme weather, and making it locally relevant. So I always say, remember, there's a lot of information to take in. The report's there if you want to read it in your own time, which goes more into all the different sections about the groups. And also remember that some of these audiences may be easier for initial engagement in climate discussions, especially if you already yourself has personal connections to them. So start there, and then you can work your way up when you have more experience in talking about climate action. So just some examples of how this can be put into actions. Britain Talks Climate applied this to if, for instance, they were engaging with a parent. So being a parent is an identity, not a value, and it's not just enough to speak to parents as people. You really have to understand their other values and identities and how they intersect. So they ran about 4 different key narratives past a wide group of parents to see what would work. So their narratives were protections. For instance, we love our kids and we'll move mountains to protect them. And the practical steps they're taking as parents. So intergenerational togetherness was another narrative, looking at how if every generation works together, they can make a real difference on climate change, protect the shared home. Inheritance, looking at that we want to leave the world a safe and healthier place for our children. and that working together as parents is the way we can do this. And their final narrative they found was chances, and that there are a group of parents and carers who are rolling up their sleeves to make sure that next generation the same chances they had. And the results showed that not all the messages worked with all the parents. So parents of younger children, for instance, were more connected to the key narratives of protection and inheritance. And all messages connected slightly more strongly with women than men. The protection and chances frames were more polarizing than others. So for some people, they found it particularly inspiring, but for others, less so. And also different messages interestingly triggered different emotional responses. So protection and heritage elicited slightly higher feelings of concerns, whereas togetherness was much more about hope and motivation of actions. And connecting to the audience groups we looked at before, for instance, the left-leaning civic pragmatists connected most strongly with togetherness and inheritance frames, connected to the narratives that we looked at previously, and then the right-leaning loyal national favoured protection togetherness frames. So it just goes to show that really different narratives do work for different audiences, and also it can determine like how your climate action is going to go. When I read this research, I found it really interesting about the emotional responses section, and that focusing on stuff like togetherness was really the hope and motivation, which is what we kind of focus a lot on in climate action, is the positive side and the difference you're making. So they've also applied this research to rural communities. So why is it so important to engage with particularly rural communities, and how can this be different? So the research found that different key narratives have been identified, and specific segments are different than the national average. So for instance, in rurals, they found that there's an increased amount of established liberals, an increased amount of backbone conservatives. So narratives that resonate with those two might work better in a rural community. Also, the research found that it's really important to engage with rural communities so they feel more connected in the environment movement. So in their study, they found that 85% agree that too much in our country is decided in London, and 50% say that the area where they live has been neglected for a long time. So alongside framing segments towards narratives that can also follow universal high concern, they also found that rural citizens had their own slight narratives that really resonated with them to frame your discussions, such as protection of the natural environment, stopping plastic pollution, trying to prevent deforestation and air pollution. These were 4 really key areas of high concerns which found were good platforms to start climate discussions. Additionally, support for renewables is also higher in rural areas, with 75% of rural citizens thinking that cutting carbon emissions is important to create new jobs. So that is a kind of overview of different audiences. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jasmine. So we'll take a break here for questions. Any questions about what we've just heard? Feel free to either raise your hand or unmute yourselves directly, or pop questions in the chat.
No worries if not. That was the hi Jo.
Hi. Just a quick question around it's interesting what you were saying about the different groups that there are, but it presumably it's not essential to know who's in your groups before you start, and you can try and sort of like pitch a, if you like, a generic message, and then maybe pick things up as you go along and then tweak it as you go.
Definitely, like as the research, well, if you're going by the research, there was the universal key narrative, so always quite safe as a kind of starting point. Right. Looking, for instance, at creating a greener future is really key, and so if you just start with safe universal ones, and then so you get to know your audience more and what might resonate with them, you can tailor your conversations to that.
Thank you.
Can I jump in here with one thought, which is just, there is a website called Cambridgeshire Insights, which is a fantastic resource, and I'll put the link in the chat in a moment, for understanding more about your community and who is in it. So it's got incredibly detailed information about sort of education, income, car ownership, you name it, and you can do it on varying degrees, you know, right down to the kind of parish level, or, you know, I think you can pick and choose what level you're looking at, or, you know, which parish you're looking at. Yeah, very useful if you you know, at least just want to kind of get an approximation of, you know, the makeup of your community.
There's no other questions. I can go on to messaging approaches. I can say it's less research heavy than the first section. So
Oh, go ahead.
fantastic. Just got to. Two seconds. Fantastic. So these messaging approaches are from Britain Talks Climate Rural Research. So while it is tailored towards rural community in places, many of the general principles can be applied across the board. So we'll look at some of the key do's and don'ts of messages over the next few slides. With conversations, I think it's always key to remember patience. You can't expect to get everything right on the first time you have a talk about climate action. And also, while this is all research based, it might work differently with your audience and when you put it into action. So learn as you go, like we were literally just talking about. And as you get to learn your audience more and what resonates with them, you can tailor your approaches towards them. So a first do or don't is think local. Particularly key, it's been found for rural communities. So linked to local identity and local leadership. As we saw previously, many people feel that a lot of decisions that affect their community are out of their control and decided by higher uppers. So by focusing on grassroots and bottom-up approaches that involves and listens to those who are actually affected can go a long way in climate change communication. So yeah, the don't is avoid simple echoing top-down messages. Trusted communicators, this is key. So place local people at the centre of communication. So actively seek out those members of the community who are seen as representative of the local population. So for instance, who are the people are more likely to listen to? Who are the people they respect? So for instance, it might be a parish priest, it might be somebody who runs in the community centre. In climate change communication, people do love to focus on what the scientists have to say, which is really important, but actually coming from a trusted local voice can have just as much or even more influences in places. So a don't for this section is avoid being overly dependent on communicators who are incomers, have high education, or do not have strong roots in the area, and ensure that communicators are balanced by representation of local people. So as we were talking about in the audience section, the role of values and the narratives that you kind of focus your communication on is key. So focus on the frames of, for instance, fairness, preservation, conservation of nature, universal values that we know that most people are going to connect to and want to listen about. Avoid language that's often used by some environmental activists such as climate justice, save the planet and radical change. That's quite irrelevant to rural communications. It might be that the audience that you're working with that really resonates with. So really that's kind of, like we were saying, test out your audience, see what works. Impacts, adaptation. So people-powered responses and building resilience is key. So building in positive stories of local responses, for instance, to extreme weather events and changes as proof of local resilience. So ground messages in local values of self-reliance and how people can pull together even in the face of extreme. And yeah, the power of community. always important to focus on the positives of climate action. Obviously, we know that climate change isn't a good thing, and we do need to recognise that it is a serious problem, but we don't really always want to overplay the negatives of previous and future extremes, such as weather, because it actually can make people less likely to want to take action because they're kind of overwhelmed by the emotions. But so yeah, always focus on like the positives of climate action. So the place of climate messaging, it kind of shows what can be done for inspiration and how people can be involved. So lead with recognition of the efforts that people are already making in their lives to reduce their impact on climate. So, and don't assume people don't care, aren't willing, aren't worried, and aren't willing to do more. And it has actually been found that it's been really helpful to taking climate action and kind of encouraging people to take that climate action. It's really helpful to work through negative feelings of climate change. So that can be incorporated in this climate change messaging. A key one is promoting agency and optimism, basically people-powered solutions. So instead of emphasising what not to do, talk about what people can do. So the positive and optimistic messages and how people can come together and be part of that positive change. So avoid fatalism while recognising the scale of the challenges ahead. So like we said, don't always go towards the negative alarmist approaches. Really put the positive kind of what we are doing as a community to basically combat the climate crisis and make a difference. This is very good for rural communities, using symbols of local and national pride. So positive messages about national and local pride, such as supporting local industries, British agriculture. Rural citizens have a strong connection with British countries and urban citizens. However, some urban places might be very connected to their local countryside as well. So it could also work for instance, we're going to talk in the middle of Cambridge. And yes, avoid potentially diversive, polarising issues and culture or topics. Effective imagery is a key one. So visual communication can go a long way in kind of communicating about climate action. As people say, a picture says, I think it's 1,000 words. So it's really important to show people like taking that positive action, show people doing stuff, being part of the solution, and prioritise diversity and ensure a strong representation across the board. So one of the key groups that talk about this is Climate Visuals, and they have 7 key principles. So they say when you're doing your climate images, you should show real people, you need to tell new stories, you need to show that climate change is happening and is happening at a scale so you have the reality of what's happening, but also show that how it's impacting locally. So a good one for Britain quite often is floods. That's the extreme weather events of how that's affecting people locally. Show emotional and powerful impacts. Choose images that are going to connect with your audience. And be careful with protest imagery. It has its place and it can be like really positive, saying this is the community making a difference, coming together, but for certain audiences it might not resonate as well. And the key rule is it needs to be people-centered narratives and positive solutions, and it needs to resonate with the identity and values of the viewers. So not just geared towards what we think is traditional environmentalists. And this we can drive positive engagement to climate action. So Climate Visuals does have useful stock imagery. The websites on the page there on climate change if you yourself wanted to use some images to talk about climate change to your audiences, and they have chosen images which are based in best practice and research. So here on your screen we've got a few examples of handy climate images that you can use. So we've got one on the far right of flooding, so a local impact. You can tell it's in the UK, we've got a fat face in there. I haven't seen that anywhere else in the world. We've got people taking action doing stuff, so someone growing vegetables, we've got putting renewables up. We've also worked in that key narrative of waste less there, so we've got a picture of our repair cafe, people engaging in positive action, positive conversations, and all of these, you involve people within your imagery. So another piece of research that has been done is looking at diversity within images. So for instance, images of green places and natural spaces. Climate change communication and engagement research has shown that engagement with nature is a key entry point for thinking about climate change. However, the majority of images that we tend to see out there depict more of a narrow set of people and the activities that take place. So Natural England, basically, they commissioned this work to work out how can we include more diversity in images and the importance of it. Because images are really powerful. They can reinforce known barriers to accessing the natural environment or taking part in climate action, but they can also, if done right, encourage inclusion and create a more open space for people to get involved. So they came up with 6 key principles to address broadening the understanding of diversity to visitors to natural environments. And as you can see, some of these principles overlap with what we just looked at. So we've got use images to tell positive, identifiable stories, create authentic representation, not just tokenism, so actually trying to involve people in the images, depict diverse activities in diverse landscapes. So it's not just the people involved, it's what's happening and where it's happening as well. Connect people to the one diversity of natural places, include more real people in images, and diversify who's behind the camera and the message. So back onto some of our do's and don'ts. You've got the duty and shared responsibility. Represent the environment is something we all have a duty to protect, but avoid telling people how they should act. So people respond negatively, as we said, to perceived top-down messages. So really show that you're listening to them and what affects them, and they can be part of the climate action process. So communicating goals and targets. So the do here is talk about policies in terms of pragmatism, responding flexibly and addressing to the problem sensibly. Don't overpromise on unreasonable targets. So use interim targets so we get to net zero by 2050 by phasing out diesel and petrol cars by 2030. And finally, do or don't is change in continuity. So do talk about continuity and about how changes help to maintain security and preserve what people value. Stress continuity between the past and the future and during past experience. But avoid language that suggests radical overhaul, because it can be quite daunting to some people thinking that everything's going to change. So for instance, while changes in the weather will be something new, our responses are part of a long story of steady, intelligent responses to new and changing situations. It's kind of like drip feed. If there's going to be changes, have it slowly, not the end picture straight away. So the approaches we just covered are really great if you're wanting to reach particular audiences on a wider scale, but meaningful everyday one-on-one conversations can also play a key role in empowering, inspiring climate action. So the more people we get talking about climate crisis, the wider reach and impact we can have. So again, the Climate Outreach has created a talking climate handbook, and that aims to get everybody in the world talking about climate change. So you don't have to be expert to talk about climate or climate action. By following this advice, you can have constructive conversations regardless of having extensive knowledge or background. So the handbook itself suggests that you follow a topic of real talk. So number 1, respect your conversation partner and find common ground. So find out what you have in common with the person you're talking to and show them respect for their concerns and priorities and values. Many people can feel blamed and judged when they talk about climate change, especially when it comes to talking about what they're doing in their own personal life, whether that is what they eat, how they get about. And like their carbon footprint, and it can make them defensive or withdraw from the conversation. So always show that you're respecting and listening to what they have to say. As the person leading the conversation, enjoy it. This really can set the tone of the conversation. The person is more likely to also enjoy talking to you too. And you kind of build that sense of trust and rapport, which might make them more open to talking about the issues affecting them and how they can potentially take part in climate action. Ask questions. Don't lecture your conversational partner about your views. Instead, ask them what climate change means personally to them. So give them space to reflect on their own experience and views and on the issues. Listening and show you've heard is also key. So concentrate genuinely listening to what the other person really has trying to say, and show that you've heard and kind of bounce off each other and respond to what they're saying. And tell your story. This is key, putting human at the heart of climate action. You don't need to know everything about climate science to talk about climate change. Your climate change story and how you become engaged in the issue and why this concerns you can be one of the most powerful communication tools available to you. For instance, if you are using a stat, try and conceptualize it and make it relevant to your partner and how it will affect them. A climate story or a case study can help with this and help bring it alive. Action makes it easier. So sometimes it's easier to talk about climate action when you're doing something or you've got an example ready to hand, such as a climate case study of an action that you've previously taken, the difference it made. These can make conversations easier and it can make it feel less overwhelming. People often, when they talk about climate change, are talking about the struggling with the size of the issue and the problem, and don't skirt around that. It can actually be helpful to acknowledge that climate change is a huge area of work that in your conversation, but every action that somebody takes can start making a difference to the climate change. And learn from the conversation. So learn how others think about climate change, and also learn how you can go forward and have either improve this conversation or how it works for someone else, and how you can keep having these good conversations. The more people you talk to, the more people you might engage with the issue of climate change or climate action, and hopefully have even far-reaching positive impacts. And most importantly, keep going and keep connected. Every conversation you have is valuable, and you never know when something will resonate with someone and inspire climate action. I would really recommend reading this report that I've linked. It's not so much kind of research heavy as all the others, and it even provides, for instance, sample phases to help guide each section of your conversation. It also has a really kind of handy section that looks at overcoming common challenges when you have climate conversations. So for instance, if the person you're talking to is feeling overwhelmed by climate change and its negative impacts, the suggested solution is to pair conversations about the impact of climate change with discussions about potential achievable solutions. And it highlights the importance of acknowledging and discussing your negative emotions. Another key one it addresses is the feelings of blame and shame, making climate conversations feel difficult. And then their suggested solution is respect the person you're talking to rather than judging their views or voices. Deliberately talking about climate change can feel awkward, controversial, or difficult. And the key is here, don't focus it on a conversation where there's a winner out of it. Treat it as a conversation. So instead, identify common ground to connect over and use appropriate language for the person that you are speaking to. And then finally, climate change feeling like a distant problem, bring it closer to home. So asking questions about their own concerns, feelings, and response to climate change, and connect with the issues through, for instance, bring how climate change itself is affecting Cambridge, or how it is going to affect Cambridge in the near future, whether they know anyone who's already been impacted, for instance, has someone impacted by floods. And then as the person leading the conversation, tell your story, whether that is you've been affected yourself, or how you got involved in climate action yourself, or how you first heard about climate change and the actions that you're taking. And that really kind of makes it more relevant and less distance for the person. So here's a few examples of what we have just covered. So this is an example looking at how to use the narratives. So it demonstrates the do's and don'ts. This is for a rural audience in practice, and it's so it looks at talking. If you look at the highlighted first blue, waiting for someone else, so it talks about the need for initiative and local leadership, how we all need to be part of doing something now. And then so we must start making our own plans to protect our area and to protect our local communities from these events. So making a plan, it emphasizes stability and pragmatism, addressing to problems sensibly. So kind of the key do's and don'ts in this is local leadership, really putting that local people are kind of leading on flooding response, framing action positively, and that climate action makes sense. So it's not only that we need to do it for everyone, but it's really helping this local community. Looking closer to Cambridge, we've got our climate action case studies. So these are, we've got these on our website, or the Cambridge Carbon Footprint website, and they're a collection of case studies of how people are taking climate action within their own community. So we have everything from people going plastic free for a month, to creating a community woodland, to people growing their own vegetables, or we've got a business case study, Green Blue U, on how they're minimising their environmental impact as a small business. So key to this is their trusted community communicators. We've got Anna, who was did I think actually the first session for this. She's with Camcycle, talking about trying to promote cycling in Cambridge. It connects with those universal narratives we were looking at. So we've got reducing waste, such as Green Blue U, going plastic free, protecting them and protecting the natural environment. And then it shows people taking positive action. It puts human at the centre of climate action, and it kind of gives an example of what actions other people can take if they're interested in taking climate action. And then this is from Cambridge Carbon Footprint himself, and how they have engaged in the community in climate conversations. Again, it's all people orientated, showing people being part of the solution and taking agency. So active issues, active engagement issues, and positive framing. So for instance, on here we've got the repair cafes, we've got a swish, which people bring clothes and swap, and we've got us at a festival. So it puts community at the centre of the problems, well, of the solutions, not the problems, that's the wrong word. People taking pride in their community. So for the events, for instance, they also provide a natural and trusting environment to start conversations and engage with the issue on climate change and climate action based on the proactive actions that people are already taking. And it really frames how people's ability to be part of effective change in the community. So an event is a really good kind of organic way to start talking about climate action, and whilst you can actually see people taking action themselves. So one thing that Cambridge Carbon Footprint's got coming up is their human library. So that's the concept of a unique skills fest event where you can borrow a person rather than a book. The books are a subject matter of experts, and you can borrow them to talk about and chat about their area of expertise. So, but this is also a key way to talk about climate action. You've got a range of trusted communicators and a range of topics which people can choose from that suits their values and what interests them. So for instance, on our screen we've got nature conversation, conservation, repairing, we've got renewable energy, and all of these are showing how are people at the heart of the positive solutions, and that it's grassroots action and local leadership leading the way on climate solutions. So, for instance, Net Zero Now, another way of talking about climate action, which we've been doing for the last 4 weeks, and it's designed to help people build up from the ground and have the solutions, be able to reach and engage people around them. And as Annie said, that if you've missed any of the other sessions, you can go back and watch them and help you. That can help with your climate action conversations. We're nearly at the end of this section on messages. So the key takeaways from this is understand your audience, engage people's values, think about who your messenger is and how that can connect with the community. Speak on positives and focus on agency of people and what they can do and the differences they can make. Use visuals of people taking positive action and ensure the diversity is included. Listen, respect, and learn when you're talking to having conversation with people. Make it tangible and relevant to them, and avoid technical jargon. You might have to use it in places, but always try and make that relevant to person and tell a climate story as you go along.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. That was really good. Thanks. Lots of really useful stuff there. So let's do a round of questions. I'm sure you've got some questions for Jasmine before we take a break. Joe.
Thanks. Yeah, Jasmine, have you found, well, I'm assuming that you've been talking about these issues for some time, and have you found that audience has been more receptive lately, probably in the light of COP26, that type of thing? Has it made a difference to the talks that you do?
I would say, so I mean, I'm guessing Annie and Lana can also say from their own personal experience, I would say that climate change has got easier in talking about it in communities, and people are more receptive of it. But I would say there's certain ways that people like to talk about climate change that works better than others. So renewable energy, that tends to be quite positive, or talking about maybe cycling or public transport. But if you say talking about going vegan, or that hasn't worked, that doesn't always, it's a bit more controversial than that. Obviously it depends on your audience. So I think in general people have been more receptive to talking about climate change because it is talked about more, people are more aware of it, and people are more aware that there is a need to act. But when how much it diverges onto like what they have to take action personally, and how integral that is to that life, there can still be tricky parts there. Which doesn't mean that those conversations can't take part. It's just you've got to have a bit more thought about how we frame that, and it can be a bit more complicated. I don't know, Alana and Annie, if you have any insights on your own personal experiences.
I mean, I would just say that, you know, concern about climate change has been growing steadily in the UK. But I think it changed dramatically in 2019 with the school strikes and then with XR. And I mean, those were very different. They had a very different impact on it, but both of them really raised the profile of climate change. And I think, I mean, XR was very divisive, but I think that they were actually deliberately so. I think one of the outcomes of the school of the a lot of the actions that XR undertake is that it makes the more mainstream sort of climate action seem much more palatable than dealing with people who are perhaps a bit extreme. And so then, you know, also having the kind of school climate strikes, which, you know, taps into those issues around kind of the legacy for future generations, which reaches through to a lot of audiences. I think, you know, that was a really powerful combination, and I noticed a huge change at that time. And actually we had to really take stock of the work that we were doing at CCF and think, okay, like what is our niche in this changing conversation. I mean, and I think we have that. We are there to support people to practically make changes and to sort of take climate leadership to kind of influence other people to take leadership as well. And we think that we speak to audiences that XR doesn't. People who are concerned about climate change, who are absolutely put off by those kinds of actions and those kinds of narratives that they engage with. So yeah, I do think that now is a great time to be talking about climate change. I mean, definitely the pandemic changed things again. but not necessarily in a bad way. I mean, it definitely took the focus off on climate change, but consistently climate change is still ranking, I think, in the top 3 of things that people are most concerned about in the UK. So, you know, the concern is probably at roughly the highest that it's ever been. Yeah, it's fertile ground.
My experience really talking about climate change is that so many people feel totally paralyzed. I think what can I do? What it doesn't help anyway. Looking at the big picture, there's so much happening, and the contributions they could make seem so small that they don't do anything at all. Which
I think that's quite common. A lot of people I know have found that even just taking action is a way to work through those emotions. So even if you're not taking action to make that big dent, just starting to do something can be a way to take stock of those emotions and kind of work through it. And then hopefully you can go on and try and see your place kind of making a difference. And the one that Cambridge Carbon Footprint does use a lot is the 60% of changes needs to happen personally from your home. And I think it can seem like such a big thing. You hear about all of these big industries and the impact that they're making, which is obviously one thing we really do have to combat, but you can make a personal difference by thinking about your lifestyle and changes, and just actually by taking actions, it can be a way to work through those negative emotions. There's quite a lot of research, actually. I think it's called like ecological despair, and it looks at the use of action and pragmatism and how it can be a way to really help you work through those kind of emotions.
The other thing I think is going back to, you know, for the people who were there for the first Net Zero Now session, when we looked at the different levels of climate action and sort of, you know, I guess sharing that perspective with people that, you know, it actually takes effective climate action requires action on all levels. You know, none of the pieces of this puzzle are isolated, and actually all of the choices that we make, you know, affect the other parts of the system. And that's the thing that I think gets lost. You know, it's very, I think we psychologically try and dissociate ourselves from it because it's easier, and, you know, point the fingers at, you know, it's business and it's politicians. But as hard as it sounds, we actually do have influence on both of those things. So, you know, everything that we buy, you know, is a possible market signal that we're sending. And so, you know, I think we feel more disempowered than we actually are. So, you know, it can be actually really positive. You know, it doesn't have to be combative. It can be positive to help encourage people to feel that they can do something. Not that they have to, but that they actually do have the power to do something, and to kind of encourage change, even if it is indirectly, through, you know, influencing businesses in their shopping habits, or, you know, having conversations with their politicians or with their friends and family.
I think that what the pandemic really helped is that everyone enjoyed their local communities more, right? So everyone had the parks, so that was the very, very local thing. I think that's what, just doing something very locally within the spaces which everyone like now knows about having or values more, is, I think, a good catch to get everyone like through the social.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Shall we take a break here, and then after the break we have the second half of Jasmine's presentation, focusing more on actually planning your communications and some tips and tricks when you actually produce communications for your community and for your climate action. So shall we come back at 10 past and then we'll continue. Thank you.
Okay, everyone ready for me to start now? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so obviously in the last section we looked at the very nitty gritty of talking about climate action and climate change, identifying audiences, looking at different messaging and approaches. So great, we've looked about how to communicate, but in the next section we'll look at how we can actually get that message out. And it's kind of a crash course in creating a communication plan. There's a bit more to it, but this should give you all the essentials that you need. So what's a comms plan? It's quite simply is an important tool to help you streamline your messaging that meets your communication aims and helps you provide structure on both who you want to reach and how you are going to reach them. It will make things easier in the long run, with you having identified your key aims, your messages, and the audiences and channels you're going to reach out with. And it also allows you to plan like your communications over a period of time. So for instance, if you're going to be trying to run a community engagement campaign for 6 months, this plan will help you kind of track out when your communication is going to happen throughout the month, who are you going to target, and how are you going to build up. So elements of this plan will be covering this section are looking at like what the aims of your communication plan might be, who are the key audiences of the plan, what sort of messages could you do, and how will this differ with each audience, and what channels will you use to reach your audience and spread your messages. It's also kind of good to think that this plan is not set in stone, stuff might change, it's just useful for guidance to kind of keep you on track, but it doesn't mean that if you said it's got to happen on the 3rd month, that bit's got to happen on the 3rd month. Things change, so you can be very flexible with it as well. So the first section is comms plan aim. The first thing we'll establish from starting your plan is what are these proposed aims? So what does your project want to achieve, and how can communication support your project's goals? So think about what you want the outcomes of the communication to be and how to support the goals of your project. Limit plan to 1 or 2 aims max to avoid spreading yourself too thinly, and also try and create aims that you feel like you can realistically achieve. Bear in mind how you'll measure success of your aims from when you evaluate communications to help guide future activity. So are you trying to look at how many people you want your communications to reach, or are you, if you're trying to do an event, are you judging it by how many people arrived at the event? So I'm going to talk in the idea of the Cambridge Climate Change Charter, just because that's the one I had a bit more experience of and looking at how we communicated that in terms of aims and stuff, but you can put it into many different situations. So for example, with the charter, when I established it, the communication, I had 2 main aims that would resonate with our work, and then I chose a primary aim that I wanted the communication really to focus on. So that was to increase the reach and sign-ups of the Charter for Cambridge organisations, businesses and individuals, particularly within hard-to-reach audiences who don't usually engage in sustainability issues. And my idea was to regularly use communications over a wide variety of channels, projects and organisations to establish the Charter as a recognisable brand for climate action in Cambridge. And then we also had a secondary aim, which we would also touch in our communications, but it wasn't the key drive. So engage with the local call to action and supporting, empowering and celebrating the positive action that was happening in the community, and establishing an infrastructure for support and guidance by tailoring messages to audiences with incentives, frequency, tone of voice, and using trusted communicators and providing platforms and events for deeper engagement. Also, in a way you can think about it, the secondary aim by kind of support the primary, and through hoping with get your communication about that, it also supports your primary aim of your communication plan. So audience, we touched on it beforehand, and it's really important when you're planning your comms plan, what audience you're trying to reach. So who do you need to reach in order to achieve your project's goals? Different audiences might be important to connect to for different parts of your projects. So you need to think, what audiences will also benefit from my project? You want to, or your climate action communication, you want to reach people that are really going to benefit from what you're going to have to say. So for me, I find it personally helps to brainstorm all the potential audiences that your communication plan could reach out to, and then prioritize from there, identifying which ones will best help you reach your project's goals and aims. So using the Cambridge Climate Change Charter as an example, we wanted to expand for the messaging to resonate with not just individuals in Cambridge, but also to connect with other businesses to sign the charter. So there were two very broad audience groups. And so we could then choose direct messaging that went for one group, individuals, and then direct messaging that also went for another group of businesses. But you can also then break this down even further and look at which groups maybe within those individuals. So is your communication being tailored towards parents, for instance, or is it being tailored towards I don't know, farmers, and see which ones you need to prioritize engagement with. For instance, if you're thinking about hard to reach audiences, if that's a particular focus of your climate action, you can think about reaching out to religious groups, young adults, families. So yeah, and climate aware, but maybe unsure how to act people. So that's like the further breakdown. If you're looking at, for instance, businesses, we want to look at local businesses. We didn't just target kind of businesses in general. We really focused on SMEs, trying to get in contact with them and try and get the charter messaging relevant to them. So why is it important to identify these potential audiences? Well, like we've just said, different audiences might require different tailored messaging, communication channels, and different approaches. And it's always handy to think about maybe your audience pathways. So which audiences and groups do you already have a good connection with, and how can they potentially put you in connection with others? And think, how are you going to reach certain audiences? Does it require going through, like we said, a trusted community voice in the previous section, or a connected group or organisation? That's also key to think about when you're putting your communication plan in place. So how I personally do it is it's quite hard to read, but I did like a little brainstorm of all the different audiences we could potentially reach out to, the different ways we could potentially get in touch, not just via, like, obviously through social media, but if you're emailing directly, if you're sending out newsletters or updates, how could we go through? And kind of work out those pathways and prioritize down from there which audience was my climate action communication would really work for and resonate with. And so once you have chosen your kind of audiences and how they work with your communication plan's aims, you need to think about what are the key messages you want to share that will support the aims of this plan, and how will these messages resonate within your chosen audiences. For instance, do they need to be tailored depending on who your communication is aimed at? Messages should be targeted, precise, relevant, and consistent. So avoid spreading yourself too thinly and avoid having too many different messages involved in your comms plan. It's better to have just one key message which people like, that is what you're trying to say, rather than having 5 maybe important messages but people are unsure of what you're trying to say. So clarity and preciseness is key. To help streamline your communications, it can always be important to think about the hierarchy of messages. So what is the main message that you want to consistently convey each time you talk about your project? And what do you want, if people hear about, like, what you're doing, what do you want the first thing that they think, oh, that's what they do? Can also be helpful for self-review later on in your comms project to check if the communication content you are disseminating still supports the messages you're putting out. So always start by thinking about what are the general messages that support your chosen aim, and then consider if for different audiences, how can they be tailored specifically to different audiences you're trying to reach. So to bring back the example, so the main message we focused on was having an overarching theme of Cambridge, a community of climate leaders. And then from there, we tailored our different little kind of different, our different messages from that key message. And made it relevant to businesses or locals. So for instance, one of the messages we said is, as a community, we can all take positive action and be part of the solution by reducing our carbon footprints. Or the Charter demonstrates Cambridge community's commitment to taking action on climate change and a platform that enables support one another and making a meaningful difference. Both of these all connect to the key message of Cambridge community of climate leaders, but they're two slightly different messages if you're wanting to kind of mix it up a bit and talking about it. So we also tailored this if you're talking to an individual. So for instance, for an individual, we might try and look at the co-benefits of taking climate action. So support your friends and family through positive climate action. And for a business, we might just do something as simply as join a community of like-minded businesses, or be on the wave of change and stay ahead of the latest net zero developments with the support of the Charter. So all of these feed into the idea of taking action and being part of the community movement, but they're slightly different depending on the audiences that we're looking at. So after you've got your aim, your audience, your message, you then need to think, how are we actually going to reach the people that we want to talk to? How are we going to get these messages out? So this is where channels come in. Different audiences, again, can be reached through different channels. And you can think about both internal and external channels and opportunities, and which one will work best for each audience. So for instance, you've got social media such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you've got websites. If you're doing more of a community-based conversation, you might look at a community newsletter or website, reaching out them to feature there, or having, if you're a small organisation yourself, having your own newsletter. You've got events, media such as print newspapers, local magazines or local radio, promotional materials such as leaflets, which can reach out to local groups to help promote your project. There's so many different channels that you can reach out for communication. I won't keep going because I'm sure I could be here forever, but different ones might work better for certain audiences. So if you're wanting to reach out to younger adults, typically social media will probably engage them more, and then also think about which channel you're looking at. Facebook, it tends to have slightly of an older demographic, whereas Instagram is definitely resonates more with younger people. TikTok apparently is a thing now. I haven't really engaged with that. I mean, feel free to try yourself, but yeah, thinking about which platforms they use most. Cambridge is really good as a university town, so you can reach out to be involved potentially in university fairs or contacting student unions to get involved. That's one communication kind of avenue that you can use to try and get in touch with your audiences. With the Charter, we looked particularly at reaching out to businesses such as SMEs. So certain channels that we identified was reaching out directly. Sometimes the best channel can be just giving them a phone call or giving them an email. That can work. We identified local business newsletters or magazines to promote the Charter through. And then one way that a lot of people tend to use for communicating about climate action or getting people bored is trying to find high profile kind of individuals or businesses to give legitimacy to your project. And like we saw in our previous stuff, this can, if it's a trusted organisation or individual, this can go a long way. So there are many different channels that we did use to promote the Charter, and since we try to reach a range of audiences, messaging needs to have regular communications through the wide range of channels, projects and organisations. So depending on the scale of your project, you can just decide to focus your energies on maybe a couple of channels and a couple of audiences. Like we said, don't spread yourself too thinly. but always try and keep that communication regular, even if it's just once a week or a couple of times a week, so it's always in people's minds about what you're trying to say. So don't be afraid to use your community connections. That's, I would say, a key tip when you're talking about how to reach out to people, to get the word about your climate action. It might even help identify new communication channels and opportunities. Like audience pathways, I like to view them as communication pathways. Sometimes even just using like the right hashtag or social media post can connect you to a new audience, an opportunity. Sometimes finding the right, say, if you do use Instagram, if you connect with an influencer who's happy to support your work or promote the message you're trying to say, that can go a long way to expand into to groups of people or communities that might not be aware of what you're doing, but that can draw attention into there. So after you've got all of those other components we looked at, you can then look at approach and timeline. So going forward, your comms plan, how is this going to spread out over a certain period of time, and how are you actually going to do this? So you want to strategize how and when you implement your communication plans. So there's certain questions to get you started. How will you get your messages out for your chosen channels? Is there any key dates you want to time communication around? And what is your time period to meet your established aims? For instance, a key date that I can think of coming up is June the 5th, World Environment Day. And a lot of people who are involved in kind of environment stuff tend to hinge a lot of their communications around that day, building up to it, and even have a project. And then, like we said at the beginning, remember it's okay to adapt your communication plan if needed. Be that approach, the timeline. It's also okay to experiment, see if something doesn't work, try something new halfway through to see if it works better. Flexibility is key. It's very rare that everything goes perfect and like you planned. And if this is your first time carrying out communications, you'll probably learn a lot as you go along, what does and doesn't work, and particularly in range to the audiences you're trying to reach out. So it's always helpful to try and take some time to review your progress and your plan as you go along, and that'll just help you make the most of your time and efforts. So I've got a few examples now of how you could put that into practice. So we're going to look a bit of social media to begin with. So here's a few social media posts that we did for the Climate Change Charter, Cambridge Climate Change Charter. It's a mouthful, the project. So in each post, we've tried to draw attention to the issue at hand while staying focused on the positive community and solutions that people are taking. So for instance, on the first one, we really look at what climate action do you want to see happening across Cambridge this new year. If you're looking for inspiration on positive climate actions that you can take in 2022, make sure to explore our Cambridge Climate Change Charter Advice Hub, link in our bio. While there, join a community of climate leaders and help make this green future a reality in Cambridge. So we've really tried to focus on the positives, put in some key narratives that resonate with people, try and start a discussion, what climate action do you want to see happening in Cambridge across this new year, trying to engage with the community, and then put the call of action in, what can people do? So some tips when doing social media and comes to climate action and change. Like we're saying, really useful to try and connect to key events, days and trends. Like I mentioned, the World Environment Day, and even like you can just create them into a hashtag and it can get some wider reach. Messaging is really important, so you don't really want your text post to be too long. Remember that images can also show a lot of the information that you're wanting to say. So you don't really want to put an essay because people probably won't read that. Try and create conversations and discussions. You obviously want to broadcast the messages and the work that you are doing out of the community. But if you're wanting to reach a wider audience, varied content that they can engage with will help drive up numbers of people who are looking at your stuff. So simple as asking a question like, what is, I don't know, what is your favorite green action to take, or what is your key tip for this? That might get people engaged and start talking with your project and your climate actions. this is kind of related to your message. Decide what is your call of action, and try and incorporate in as many posts as possible. And within your post, try and also highlight why this call of action is important and why it should matter to your audience. It's kind of helpful to try and make your post recognizable as coming from your group, so it can help create a constant tone and branding. So hopefully you can see in these posts that we've tried to keep to a charter theme of the charter colours, the kind of how the boxes, the language we use, for Cambridge Carbon Footprint, so that if somebody sees it and say we haven't actually got Cambridge Carbon Footprint logo on there, they can still feel connected to our work. Always try to use an image to support your post wherever possible. It's just been shown that people engage more with social media posts if there's an image attached. Even if your URL comes up with an automatic image, it's just shown that if you pop your own image on top, that tends to get better engagement and people tend to look at your post more. So you don't have to create your images like I've done that. They do take a lot of time, so general images of either what you are doing or maybe a supporting kind of stock image that fits with what we looked at, the advice from Climate Visuals, that can also be used. There's quite a few free imagery sites out there. Unsplash is heavily is one that people tend to use quite a lot. These can be really useful even if you're just maybe talking about a low carbon mill. Finding one that supports your message, pop it on there, that can get it out. And always remember that different social media platforms have different, for instance, requirements on posts, so text count and image size. So with the top one here, we've got a Facebook post. However, so that's got more words, more hashtags. The image size is different. Have the one below that Twitter has a limit of 280 characters, and the kind of the size of the image is slightly different. On Instagram, it tends to be square, and you tend to have quite a generous character count, and I think it's 30 hashtags you could use for Instagram. But the recommended advice for Instagram is shorter the caption as possible, because people tend to just read the first line. So try and at least get the first line really engaging, so people want to keep reading that post. So it's that hook that draws people in, and then put the kind of less important information under. So you just need that thing that people are like, yes, I want to look at it, and keep going, keep reading. I would say with Instagram, stories is probably being used just as much as posts. So if you make a post, always then push share to your stories, and then hopefully people can see it that way. Finally, think about the time and day you are posting and whether these posts will actually reach your desired audiences. And this time and day, unfortunately, isn't the same across each platform. So kind of research shows that Facebook, the best days is Tuesday, Wednesday and Friday, and the worst day is Saturday. Twitter, Wednesday's the best day and Saturday's the worst day. And Instagram, Tuesday's surprisingly the best day and Sunday's the worst day. I would say don't get too bogged down by the nitty-gritty unless you really love that kind of stuff. But it's always better to try and post during the weekdays, in the middle of the week. People tend to look at their social media during lunchtime and after work as well. So they can be key times to hook in. So I've popped a few of them, what we just discussed, on the screen there. And then also another example of how social media can be used to show kind of climate stories and people taking action and make a more personal connection to your audience. So in this case, this connects to one of our Cambridge Carbon Footprint's climate action blogs. And to kind of feed in engagement to the blog on our website, we just took a quote, popped it up with the kind of branding style that we wanted, and put that on social media. And hopefully then that post would draw people to read the whole kind of blog that we put. So if alongside social media, you might be trying to do more kind of physical communication as well. Key ones of those: leaflets and posters. So keep details short and succinct. Again, pop your key message at the top. Have the most important stuff at the top. That's what is going to drag people's attention in. Work your communication approaches within the text and the design. So this is our Cambridge Climate Change Charter poster. So we really put on the kind of narratives of community actions, positive solutions, building a brighter future, all within this poster. And we also looked on the key narratives of collective action, shared responsibility, and how everyone could be part of the solution to climate change. So that has all been incorporated, those kind of key how to communicate with the audiences we put into this poster. Again, we've also got the image rule, use images of people taking action. So this was people having a look around, I think a self-sufficient house, renewable energy. You don't want to put too much information on, so if you can, link through to a web page or maybe an email address, whichever one's working for you, where people can get more information. Just put the core information on the poster and then another avenue where people can find out more. And then disseminate as widely as you possibly can. So if you make a poster, it doesn't just have to be physical. You can put it online for people to see. You can put it in those key community spaces. Maybe ask one of those trusted communicators. If, for instance, they run a community space, if you can pop it up there, community shops, really engage your community, ask friends to hand them out, leaflets, all those different avenues that you can think of to try and get those posters and leaflets out wider. And then finally, a look at emails. So this is an example of just an email that we wrote for, it's a community toolkit, which is basically a toolkit which people can download and run their own workshop on how to calculate their carbon footprints with people in the local community. And for that, we composed kind of an email that they could use if they were wanting to reach people to like kind of draw them into the events. So within it, we incorporated messagings due throughout the text. So we looked at the idea of universal narratives. So that is kind of building a sustainable future for Cambridge, everyone coming together, the collective responsibility. We looked at the solutions, the positive solutions and the agency of that people have in their community to have positive change. So looking at how we can all be part of that change, positive climate actions. We used kind of trusted communicators using our stat that we love to use, the Committee on Climate Change tells us 6% changes need to reach net zero depend on behaviour change of individuals. So another hint if you're trying to send out emails is decide on a tone that works for you. At Cambridge Carbon Footprint, we try to keep it quite conversational, so how you would speak to a friend or acquaintance. However, that might work differently for you and you might have a completely different tone, but just kind of establish that. And again, similar with the poster, you don't have to include everything. You can link through to a website for further information, include an attachment such as a poster or something. Probably more preferable than including attachment is to connect it through a Google Doc, because attachments can sometimes get you flagged up as spam in emails. So if you can connect it to a kind of online kind of server where you store it, that's better to just for email kind of connections. Use a catchy subject line. Again, the stuff at the top is what's going to draw people in. If you're not engaging them in the first kind of second or so, they might not be bothered to read the rest of the email. So catchy stuff at the top, key part of the stop, and then the more kind of nitty-gritty stuff keep down at the bottom. Some kind of email etiquettes. Beware of BCCing. If you're wanting to contact multiple people, obviously BCCing is really great because you can contact people. However, it can also flag up your message sometimes as spam. And obviously you want people to be able to get that message and you want people to read it. So not always, but it's just something to be aware of. If you're realising that certain people aren't coming back or you're not getting responses, maybe send up a follow-up email just to them and identify what is happening to your emails, if it's more that people just aren't reading it because the email's not formatted right, or if it is a spam issue. And yes, that is kind of a quick overview of communication plans and how we can put some of that into practice.
Thank you. Thanks, Jasmine. Very well deserved sip of water there. Yeah, let's open the floor for questions straight away. I'm sure there are plenty.
Can I ask, you referred to there being some good websites for free images. Can you give me a few of those, please?
Yeah, so the most probably commonly used one is Unsplash. I'll get the link to that. It's completely free to use.
Yeah.
You have to do some scrolling to find nice ones.
I'm used to that.
And I don't know if have you ever used Canva?
No.
So Canva's, you can pay or you can get it free. And there are images that you can Unsplash thingy, but it's not wanting me to. So yeah, there are images that you can use on Canva. For instance, you can scale it to the size you want and then download it. Because Canva is a kind of, it's like you can create social media images on it, you can create like presentations on it, you can create a publishing tool, an online publishing tool, that's the word.
Right.
But if you're just wanting an image, you can also scale it up to the size you want and then download that as well. So, Alan's beaten me to finding the Unsplash URL. Yay. So, yeah, and I'll just Canva there. I'll pop that as well. Yeah, so that's also a hint. If you're wanting to make your own social media, Canva's a really useful tool to use because it has loads of templates. You can do basic photo editing on it. So you've got the free version, which still has quite a lot of capacity, so you can still access templates. You can make your own with like shapes, images, color themes and stuff, different fonts. And then you can also pay for a pro account. For an individual, I think it's around about £7 a month, and then that just expands like your template range, the images you can access, the more you can do. So, but it's always good to try the free one out, see if it works for you before you commit to any money. But Canva's what we Cambridge Carbon Footprint tends to use for most of our communication work.
Right. Okay. I'm using MailChimp quite a lot
yes,
through work anyway, so it's one I'm familiar with. But what I have struggled with is because I've just started sending a mail out to all staff with an eco theme, and I can't just use the usual images. I've got to come up with different stuff. So yes, that is really handy. So some places where I can go now to source these images. So thanks for that.
Any other comments, questions? Whilst you have us. No? Okay.
Sorry, no question. Thank you very much. It was all very interesting, Jasmine. It was really, really good. And
it's a lot of information. You can always go back and
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I put down your name as well. So
oh, thank you.
One other thing I'm doing is doing some voluntary stuff with school, with the School Eco Council. And obviously there's a bigger opportunity to go out to the parents via their newsletter, highlighting the stuff that the Eco Council are doing at school and maybe things that they can be doing at home. Just wondering, I mean, their firewalls are just a nightmare, so that means that MailChimp's out. Obviously wouldn't get an opportunity to send out a separate communication. Their newsletter is the worst visually laid out thing you have ever seen in your life. I just wondered if you might have any suggestions for a way of communicating to a group of people that you don't have the contacts for and will never be given the contacts for because of data protection. But you sort of got a small opportunity to kind of communicate with them through the school.
So have the school given you access to, like, you're allowed to use their newsletter if you'd like? Is that what you're saying? Or
I'm sure they would. I'm sure the Eco Council would be able to persuade a section of the newsletter or a page of the newsletter. Yeah.
I would say reach the best way, if it feels like you have to go through the school, use those kind of like channels to get in touch with those people. But you could always say if they would like to get then directly in touch with you or the Eco Council, to put the message out through there. So you make the initial contact through there, and if they're okay with you then sharing your contact details, you then hope you can kind of in the future with those people make it so it's much more direct. But it's always handy to use, like, I think schools are a really good connection. If you can get in one of them to communicate through, you really broaden the kind of audiences that you reach.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good way. Yeah.
From experience, make it as easy as possible for them to share your stuff. So if they are okay with sharing your things through their mailing list, then just send them a PDF or a snippet that they can just copy and paste into their, if you say their newsletter is so horrible that you don't want to use it, maybe just, you know, create your own little PDF and try to stick to their so first of all, make it as easy as possible for them to just share it. So if you just send it as a PDF and all they have to do is just basically stick it in their regular email and send it off, and then people can open it. That's good. From experience, maybe even ask them to just directly paste it into an email rather than an attachment, because some parents like me are like, oh, I'll open that attachment later, and then they never do. So having it directly in an email is better than having it in a PDF. And then the third piece of advice is, if they have a sort of branding, even if you don't quite like it, but if they have a color or a little logo or something that you can put in, try to use it. If they let you, absolutely do, because as soon as it sounds even the slightest bit official, people will pay more attention. But if you're come across as just another organization, just another body that they have to interact with, just another layer of admin, a lot of people will zone out immediately. But as soon as you kind of sound as if you're official, and as if, you know, and kind of endorsed by the school, by the official body, people will pay more attention to you. So I think the hierarchy is your message directly in an email, just sent by the office with their logo on there somewhere, and people will read it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I agree with lots of all of that. I'm also one of those mums who can't be bothered to open all of the attachments.
Any other questions around comms once you've got us here? Okay, then let's just go through the last bits, the next steps. So again, thank you, Jasmine, for the presentation today. That was really, really useful. So that's that was our presentation regarding comms. Today, there is a bit of further reading. Jasmine has shared lots of other useful resources, and you'll find all of her slides in the pack that we'll share over the next couple of days. So you'll find all of the slides with her links and everything on our website. And these are just a couple of other links that you might find helpful. So spoken about the Britain Talks Climate and the Rural Attitudes to Climate Change research documents, reports that Jasmine mentioned earlier. There's also a bit of a toolkit to help you further with engaging your community. That is a really useful tool because it also mentions quite a lot of the tools that we've spoken about today. So it gives you a quick introduction to MailChimp and using Canva and SurveyMonkey and all of these useful freebie tools that you can find. So that is a really, really useful toolkit if you want to start, planning your communications. And then we've also put together a couple of worksheets for our Net Zero Now training program last year around just tips and tricks around setting up a website, planning an event, designing a graphic, or creating social media posts. So these are all links to worksheets that we've got available on our website that can help you get started when you set out to create these things. So these links are all available when we share the slides afterwards. And and as mentioned before, you will find all of the recordings of all of our sessions online, so you can always go back and have another look. And also, please feel free to share with your networks, with people you think might benefit from listening in. The nice thing about YouTube is you can play it at double speed, so you can always go back and just whisk through the content online. And this is my favorite quote from one of our attendees from last year. I realized that things can change, but it starts with me. So it's never too late to make a start and take action on climate change and be that starting point in your local community that kicks new action off. And as always, we'd appreciate your feedback. I'll drop the link to the feedback form into the chat in a second. And please take the 2 minutes that it takes to fill it in. We really appreciate your feedback, want to know how we're doing and how you're finding these sessions. And thank you very much. Thanks for attending, especially a couple of you who've actually stuck through all 4 sessions. So thank you very much for coming back and engaging with us. And thanks.